So, Don, introduce yourself and can you talk about your background and planning interests and how you got started in all of this.
Okay, well, involuntarily, but definitely involved. Don Mazziotti. Actually, I'm a transplant from University of Iowa, where I was teaching law. I have a Juris Doctorate and a Master's in Urban Regional Planning from Iowa. Taught law school and really was teaching the law of planning at that point in time, which actually persuaded me to come to Oregon because of the Fasano decision, which, as I'm sure you know, was the decision that basically said comprehensive plans trump zoning. And I had been teaching zoning law and cases for 3 years, and as a planner interested in comprehensive planning versus just simple one-off planning. So I moved here. I came here with Ernie Bonner, who I had worked with as a consultant in Cleveland, who then became the director of the Bureau of Planning. I was chief planner for the city, and my responsibilities were to actually develop the overall comprehensive plan for the city at that time. This was end of 1973. And so I've been here off and on for a while. 1978 I left, however. Went to Washington, D.C. with Neil Goldschmidt. I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Transportation during that time. And moved from that position at the end of the Carter administration to Pennsylvania, where I founded the Business Roundtable. Did that for 6 years. Developed a comprehensive statewide economic plan in Pennsylvania. Went on then to become Secretary of Commerce in Pennsylvania. Had a development company for 10 years, and finally returned to Oregon in 1998 as Chief Technology Officer for state government under John Kitzhaber. I did that for 3 years and then was recruited to be the Executive Director of the Portland Development Commission. I did that for 5 years and then left to work on the renovation of the Civic Stadium, turn it into a soccer field by the Paulson family. And subsequently did some consulting work here and there. I've been on 2 corporate boards, both New York Stock Exchange companies, both real estate companies. Then was recruited by Homer Williams to work with him at Williams and Dame Development Company, who I'd known for many, many years, going all the way back to the establishment of the Pearl District with John Gray and Homer and a number of other people that you would recognize. Right now, I'm the director of a nonprofit that I formed called Harbor of Hope for homeless people in Portland, and been doing that for the past year, as well as working on several affordable housing projects that are about to come out of the ground. That's me. That's it. That's all I can tell you.
So from a housing perspective, you've been here at the origin of what we know as Goal 10. Which
Yes.
Was adopted in 1974.
Yeah.
So could you kind of share anything that you recall about where was the inspiration, what catalyzed it, where was government as a sector, where was the private sector and civic groups as related to that dialogue, and were there alliances, were there conflicts in the discussion? With the outcome being Goal 10 in 1974.
Well, let me start a little before Goal 10 with Senate Bill 10. Senate Bill 10 was before my time, but just by a few years. And you may recall, I'm sure, that Senate Bill 10 was passed in 1968, and it established 9 statewide goals. Those 9 goals did not have an implementation component, nor did they have a funding component, nor did they have an organization to carry their banner. But in any case, if you look at the 9 goals enacted by SB 10, it did not include housing. at all. There was in the introduction mention of housing, but that was the extent of any interest at that point in time in housing. Now this is, we're going back now to 1968. Conditions are much different then than they are now, that's for sure. So, while SB 10 mandated that all cities, counties, and subdivisions adopt a comprehensive plan, the emphasis was entirely on physical planning. There was virtually nothing on housing, as I've mentioned, and the limitations of Goal 10, the lack of funding, the lack of a lead agency, and all of that resulted in the adoption of Senate Bill 100. And Senate Bill 100 in 1973 led to the 19 goals that we still have, somewhat embellished and modified by administrative orders of one kind or another, and literally hundreds of LUBA appeals. I lobbied at that time on behalf of the city with Dick Feeney, who at the time represented the county and was their lobbyist. Don Clark was chair at that point in time, and Goldschmidt was the newly appointed mayor upon the death of Terry Schrunk, later to become a fully elected mayor. In that iteration of goals, there was a goal established for housing, as you know. And that goal has been with us since that time. And so we're really reaching back a long time, 40 years or so. Goal 10 has been a part of the state planning goals, but I would say just parenthetically that at that time, transportation, public facilities to a lesser extent, which were the object of their own goal, as was transportation, dominated the discussion. In the legislature and in Portland, which at the time represented, still does, about 60% of the population if you look at the metro area. The vote on Senate Bill 100 was very interesting. In the Willamette Valley, the legislators representing districts that are west of the Cascades voted 5-1 in favor of Senate Bill 10. Those east of the Cascades voted 2-1 against. And that really tells the story of the continuing rural-urban divide in Oregon and in many other places, but in Oregon, since we have a mountain range that separates everything out. And the politics were primarily being driven by, at the time, a series of land use notables, like Ed Sullivan, who was, of course, a litigator of many land use cases, but also Goldschmidt and the city councils up and down the Willamette Valley. I was a 26-year-old lawyer, and for whatever reason was thrown in this mix of politics that I knew very little about, actually. But my first meeting on the subject of where to go with SB 100 was with L.B. Day, Glenn Jackson, and Lon Topaz, which were not only senior to me, but were prime movers behind all of this. Really wasn't in the legislature. It was more outside of the legislature with folks coming in and seeking to influence as they saw fit, seeking to influence what later became perhaps, and maybe still is, the most well-known land use planning set of goals and processes in the country. Hawaii wasn't far behind, and Florida, of course, had Maryland, but Oregon was the only state, even among those early adopters, Oregon was the only state that had a mandate for comprehensive plans to trump, excuse the expression of that word, to trump local zoning ordinances. There were, of course, a lot of legislative leaders, but most of them were focused either on physical planning or economic development. And in fact, during the course of legislative consideration, and I did not directly label or lobby the prime bill, there was no appropriation for Senate Bill 100. It took a special session later to adopt funding. 1 year later, funding was adopted so that there could actually be implementation of Senate Bill 100. At the same time, there were struggles going on over land use, this ephemeral notion of a statewide land use plan and all of this business, and economic development. And that manifested itself in Senate Bill 224, which was sponsored by Senator Burns. And Senator Burns was, I would argue, the most influential person in the Senate 100 discussion, along with Ted Halleck from Portland. Those two basically couldn't agree on much of anything as to what was the most important and least important, but they were able to agree that there's a compromise to be had, and that compromise is to adopt both Senate Bill 224 and Senate Bill 100 and implement them. And so while there were plenty of behind the scenes machinations and all that business, the net impact on planning was that it remained physical and land use as its emphasis. And land use probably not as we think about it today, but land use that focused largely on the allocation of land to uses, and on densities, and on protecting farmland, farm and forest. And so, born out of that priority were the EFU designations utilized to protect farms and open space, but it was decidedly physical planning. Housing was an afterthought at best in this mix. Housing, although it had its own goal in Goal 10, and one could argue, well, yeah, but goals 11 and 14 were necessary to implement a housing plan. While true, the real impetus behind the public facilities was not housing. It was rather controlling the expansion or growth and suburbanization of any kind, and to contribute to industrialization or economic development. Goldschmidt had a clear agenda, and his agenda at that point in time, and we're now in 1975, 1975. At that point in time, Goldschmidt had such a large cadre of followers and supporters, many interest groups, from the home builders to 1,000 Friends and many more. His first priority was the withdrawal or killing the Mount Hood Freeway. Now, interestingly, the Mount Hood Freeway was withdrawn, and the first withdrawal of any interstate highway in America, because it would have consumed 10% of the city's housing stock. That's what the right-of-way would have done. And the chief benefit would be to those people who wanted to travel to Eastern Oregon or to Mount Hood. That was kind of it. There was a ferocious battle over all of that, which, Jim, you undoubtedly remember or were part of. But the fact of the matter is, once withdrawn, we then returned immediately to a continuation of the mandate which the city did follow to create a comprehensive plan. And in that discussion, because of the Mount Hood Freeway, strangely, there was a major housing element in Portland's comprehensive plan, even though transportation was transcendent in the work of everyone at that point in time that worked for the city. So, remembering back on those days, which I worked through, it was nothing like today. That is, you didn't have a phalanx of lobbyists representing every dog in the race. There are relatively few people who were lobbyists on behalf of the major interests and associations, because people simply, or organizations, couldn't afford, didn't see the importance of having large lobbying groups, and that's just the way it was. So the outcome of all of this were not just the planning goals and objectives, but the guidelines that enhance them, and then, of course, the administrative rules that seek to clarify and implement them. That was my involvement in the beginning. I worked closely at the time with Governor McCall's people, not with the governor himself, subsequently with Bob Straub, who became governor, and then with Vic Atiyeh, who followed, and planning remained a hot topic because of its innovation, because of its intention, the attention that it garnered, and because Portland had a bunch of planners, most of whom were from the East Coast, seeking to design a comprehensive plan for a city that they weren't born in, hadn't lived in, and knew very little about. And so made a lot of this out of whole cloth. Yes, we followed the mandate of the law, we followed the statewide goals and so forth, but to be perfectly honest, they were not the drivers. It was not the approval of the Land Conservation Development Commission, which LB was heading up at that point. Rather, it was, this is the way planning needs to be done. The comprehensive plan notion was nothing new to the planning profession, but the notion that it was transcendent or superior to Euclidean zoning concepts was, definitely what drove us. In Portland, we're much different than the rest of the state because our fight was not really about farmland and wasn't really about preservation of open space. It did become ultimately about the urban growth boundary or setting the urban growth boundary, but really it was trying to acknowledge the problems in the city, which there were many, and trying to address those using planning as the tool.
So you mentioned whether it was alliances, but the number of stakeholders that were involved, particularly in housing and the housing discussion at this period of time.
Yeah.
Were there alliances? Were there particular conflicts that were occurring within those groups? What was the evolution of the housing piece of the comprehensive plan, given the state of the city at the time and different interest groups?
Well, I would say that it was, when I said it was much different than it is today, it was the representation or the factions arguing over housing, for example, the housing goal. There weren't a lot of arguments about it. The principal players, as I recall, were the home builders, as one would expect. Thousand Friends, which was embryonic at that point and just really beginning. The bankers played a role because of obviously financial implications of the comprehensive plan. There was no organized planning association at that time that played any role that I could discern. Now, individual leaders within the planning profession, people like Nohad Toulon, people like Ed Sullivan, certainly had their voices heard, but largely through their senator or representative. And for that purpose, here, Ted Halleck was the guy through which most people went. And Ted was very, very influential, as I'm sure you know. And then Senator Burns, who was from the area but was not among the vanguard of planning. He was much more interested in economic development, which arguably the whole state was interested in at this point, because we had just gone through or survived the oil shock of '73, which was fresh on everyone's mind. An energy group had been established with Joel Schatz, this weird dude who did play a role in making certain that energy and energy conservation was sprinkled throughout. But I've got to tell you, as far as the major players representing interest groups, that was about it that I observed. Now the cities played a big role. You know, League of Cities played a big role. AOI played a big role. The Associated General Contractors play a big role in all this kind of stuff. But housing was not transcendent in their view, except perhaps for the home builders. And the home builders were frankly more concerned about limits on urbanization and the growth boundary mandate than probably on anything else, because they saw that as, you know, the consumption of land that could otherwise be allocated for housing or other kinds of development.
So obviously buildable lands inventory was part of that discussion.
Yeah.
And how did the city go about looking at that time? Do you recall specifically on how buildable lands inventory was, how it evolved?
Well, I recall very, very well, because my direction was from the mayor and from the council, for that matter, to do an inventory of industrial land in the city. Craig, the Columbia Region Association of Governments, which had just recently formed and of course is Metro now, although I don't know if they'd appreciate that appellation, but I'm just saying, Craig was responsible from our standpoint for doing buildable land inventory and counts and analysis. And that satisfied us by and large. The city had been mapped and planned, and I mean, plenty was known about what was within the city's boundary. Now, there were attempts made to to expand the city, its boundaries and the number of people. And so to the extent that there was any inventory being done of land, it would be land supply on the fringes of the city that was notable, but focused largely on public facilities extension, not on housing. And so, for example, Errol Heights, probably long ago forgotten by most people except you and me, Errol Heights at the time had a water system that consisted of PVC pipes on the ground, above ground system, right, that ran all through the neighborhoods, and the kids would occasionally jump on, trip over, get hurt by. And that was thought of as an example of, you know, this is something that's got to be corrected. And that's what drove, the extension of public facilities really drove that discussion, not the inventory of buildable lands. That was not critical. We looked upon that as Craig's job. And I think they did it. I don't know, you know, the degree of detail, because we frankly, as a very provincial city, we're focused largely on interior matters. You know, now I served on 2 technical committees on Craig. One was the land use technical committee, and the other was a fledgling housing group that may have met 4 times over 3 years. The land use technical group, on the other hand, met weekly as we tried to figure out how to control the land surrounding the city. And those inventories from a political standpoint were not done because LCDC or the goals told us to, or the legislation told us to. They were done because the Mount Hood Freeway transfer or withdrawal created a huge pot of money. Okay, found money is what it did. But in order to get the support of the MPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which was Craig, it was necessary for Goldschmidt and his phalanx of supporters to work with each of the mayors in the outlying areas and to allocate some portion of those funds to those areas and projects within them. And we literally developed a map that mapped out those promises in the form of public facilities, whether they be highways, roads, upgrades, streetlights, sewer systems, whatever, literally mapped it out. And probably more than any other factor, other than transportation, which I would argue drives just about everything. That's what the emphasis was. And buildable lands was, again, a secondary consideration. I don't want to, give short shrift to the importance of land inventories, but they weren't the most important thing.
This is just a comment from me. If
Yeah.
you recall in the late 70s and such, the city's boundaries were such that there was a lot of discussion between Gresham and this whole area between those
Right.
two spaces. And my presumption is part of when they did the Inverness plant and some of the expansion sewage treatment facilities out east
Right.
between Gresham, that opened up in terms of density potential and such a lot of space that had not been really looked at. I mean, if you looked at when you and I were
You're aware of it. Right.
we're young, there was a lot of vacant land between Gresham and,
tremendous.
From Montevilla out,
Yep.
effectively.
Tremendous amount, yeah. Well, you'll recall Don Clark, who was then chair of the county commission, and Neil for that matter, but the city-county consolidation attempt. And that was really an attempt to consolidate, as had been done in Nashville, Dade, and a couple of Dade County, Florida, a couple of other places, Minneapolis, to try to consolidate the entire area into a single government. Now that didn't work, but there was considerable sentiment, and it was driven by the availability and lack of a clear path for those areas that were at that time not part of any other jurisdiction. And there are a few pieces here and there within the boundaries of Multnomah County, certainly that remain rural or outside the metro area, but very few.
So you've commented on housing kind of as a follower, not, a lagging kind of discussion.
Absolutely.
In terms of
Yeah.
this. Also at this period of time, and I kind of want to shift now into a little more update and implementation and what's happened in housing more contemporary.
Yeah.
There was a major recession in the early 80s.
I was just about to mention that.
And so you have kind of this, not disinterest in housing, but a potential lack of demand during what did have a lack of demand. A robust or unidentified or underutilized land supply from the city then boundary to Gresham, this kind of open area that was getting additional services because of the success of stopping the Mount Hood and reallocating those resources. So you had capacity. So in your experience, when you came back to Oregon, was the dialogue different? Was there, where was housing in terms of the forefront? What had changed? What had not been responded to? This continued focus on transportation and other infrastructure, had there been a shift or a renewed perspective or view of where housing sat? Or what had you seen, what had evolved in that little, in that
23-year span?
Right.
Yeah. Well, going back just for a second to your mention of the recession, I think the recession of 73 on had a profound effect on planning in that our unemployment rate was 12.5% in the state. I'm sure you remember. And the result of that is that the focus, which had been on economic development, intensified greatly during that recessionary period. And I think that had the effect of pushing away social goals, including housing. Okay, that's kind of when I left Oregon, that's where we were at that point in time.